Imagine this: you are only 10 years old, playing with your toys outside. The morning is calm until the horns of Rome sound through the air. The highest priest arrives. He looks at every child, and then points at you. Your mother starts crying. Your father cannot move. You don't understand why. They say you have been chosen as a Vestal Virgin. People call it an honor. But in truth, it means 30 years of fear and punishments so cruel that death might feel kinder. Before we begin, press the like button and subscribe if you want more hidden stories from history. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? I love seeing people from all over the world come together to learn these dark secrets from the past. Now are you ready? Because what comes next will truly shake you. Today, we uncover the 10 most terrible punishments that Rome's Vestal Virgins faced. In the heart of ancient Rome, amidst temples of marble and the relentless noise of the Forum, there stood a sanctuary unlike any other, the House of the Vestals. It was here that Rome's most sacred guardians lived, the Vestal Virgins. Their task seemed simple on the surface, to tend the eternal flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. But beneath the ritual purity and the reverent silence of the temple lay an existence filled with fear, control, and a constant shadow of death. From the earliest days of Rome, when kings still ruled and legends blurred with history, 6 girls were chosen from noble families to serve as Vestals. They were children, usually between the ages of 6 and 10, torn from their homes in a ceremony that was both celebrated and mourned. For parents, it was an honor. Their daughters would be exalted above ordinary women, granted privileges denied to all others: freedom from marriage, the right to own property, a seat of honor at public games, and protection under the law. Yet for the child, it was the end of one life and the beginning of another, a life bound in iron chains of purity and obedience. The oath they swore was absolute. For 30 years, they would live under the eye of Vesta, bound to a vow of chastity that was less about their own virtue and more about Rome's survival. The eternal flame, tended by their careful hands, was not just a fire. It was Rome itself. If it faltered, the city's fortunes faltered. If it died, it was seen as an omen of disaster, a divine warning that the gods had turned their faces away. This weight, the fate of an empire, pressed upon the shoulders of little girls. Their hair, braided into ritual crowns, carried the symbols of eternal service. Their voices, raised in prayer, were expected to remain untouched by sin. And yet, even in their exalted place, they were never free. The same law that granted them protection granted the city the right to kill them should they fail. The paradox was merciless. Vestals were honored in life, but condemned in death. They were symbols of Rome's purity, yet their humanity was never forgiven. If a Vestal stumbled, if she allowed the sacred flame to die, or if rumors of impurity arose, her punishment was unlike any other in Roman law. For a woman sworn to eternal chastity, death by the sword was considered too impure, too brutal. Instead, Rome devised a punishment that was cruel in its calmness immurement. The condemned Vestal would be buried alive. She was led through the city in silence, veiled and surrounded by priests, as the crowd looked on. Rome turned its eyes away, for it was considered unlawful to spill the blood of a Vestal. And so, the city buried her beneath the earth, leaving her with a lamp, a small loaf of bread, and a jug of water. It was a ritual designed not to shed blood, but to erase her, to let her starve, suffocate, or despair in the darkness. For every Vestal, this possibility loomed in the background of her 30 years of service. She lived as a symbol, adored yet feared, worshipped yet watched. In festivals, the people cheered her. In whispers, they doubted her purity. The flame burned in the temple, but it was her own body that became the true altar, offered to Rome whether in life or in death. Imagine the silence of that sacred house at night. 6 young women slept in chambers lined with shadows, knowing that one misstep could mean immolation of their honor and burial beneath the city they served. Their smiles in public masked the dread that never left them. To be chosen was a blessing and a curse. The people looked at them with reverence, yet those same people would not hesitate to see them entombed alive should fate demand it. The story of the Vestals begins not with fire, but with fear, a fear that bound Rome's daughters into a covenant harsher than chains, and into a history written in silence, ash, and earth. For them, the eternal flame was not just a light of the gods. It was a reminder that as long as it burned, they would live. But if it faltered, their bodies would pay the price. The story of the Vestals is inseparable from the shadow of their punishments. And among the earliest tales, whispered in Rome's memory, was that of Paneria, the first Vestal Virgin condemned to the earth. Her fate became the template for all that followed: the ritual of immurement, the cruel burial alive that haunted every generation of priestesses after her. The origins of her crime are lost in fragments of memory, but the verdict was clear. She had broken her vow of chastity, the oath that bound her not merely to the goddess Vesta, but to the very soul of Rome. In the early monarchy, when kings still wielded divine authority, King Tarquinius decreed her punishment. For Rome, no greater sin could be imagined than the pollution of the sacred hearth by its guardians. The chastity of a Vestal was tied directly to the safety of the city. If she fell, Rome itself might fall. Paneria's sentencing was carried out in silence as ritual demanded. The Pontifex Maximus, the high priest, would not soil his own hands with her blood, for shedding the life of a consecrated virgin was unthinkable. Instead, the Romans devised something colder: a death without blood, a burial that removed her from the world without staining the hands of those who condemned her. It was, they claimed, mercy. In truth, it was one of the cruelest inventions of their civilization. On the appointed day, Paneria was veiled, her body draped in white robes as if for a sacred procession. She was placed upon a covered litter, carried through the silent streets. Citizens gathered, but few dared to speak. To watch a Vestal being led to her death was to glimpse divine wrath, to feel that even the most sacred could be consumed by suspicion and fate. Some turned away, refusing to meet her gaze. Others stared, their faces pale, as if witnessing the slow death of Rome itself. The procession led beyond the Forum, past the monuments of kings, until it reached the Colline Gate. There, beneath the earth, a narrow staircase descended to a prepared chamber. It was small and cruelly simple: a couch, a lamp, a jug of water, and a loaf of bread. Nothing more. These were not gifts of comfort, but tokens of ritual, offerings meant to disguise the horror as piety. The Romans told themselves they were not killing her, merely leaving her in the hands of the gods. But the stone walls told another truth: she was being buried alive. The priests guided Paneria to the edge of the stairs. She descended slowly, her steps muffled, her form swallowed by shadow. Some accounts whispered that she went in silence, her lips pressed in defiance. Others claimed she uttered prayers to Vesta, begging the goddess to witness her innocence. But in the end, it mattered little. Once she crossed that threshold, she belonged not to the world of the living but to the tomb. When she reached the chamber, the ritual completed its cruel symmetry. The priests turned away, their duties fulfilled. The stone slab was rolled across the entrance with a grinding finality. Light faded, air grew thin, and the silence became unbearable. In that moment, the eternal city consigned one of its own daughters to the earth. No sword pierced her flesh, no blood stained the soil, and yet her punishment was more terrible than any battlefield death. In Rome's memory, Paneria became less a woman than a warning. Her fate was held up to every young girl chosen for service, a reminder that privilege came shackled with terror. To falter meant to die in darkness. To disobey meant suffocation under stone. The people spoke of her with fear, but also with acceptance, as if her immurement was proof that Rome would endure no weakness, not even from those it revered most. For the Vestals who followed, Paneria's story lingered like a phantom in their chambers. At night, as the flame flickered in the temple, they would remember her, the first to be erased by the ritual that claimed no blood yet consumed everything. Her breathless prayers beneath the earth echoed in every oath they swore, every ember they tended, every silence they endured. Rome had set the pattern. A Vestal's honor was her life, and her punishment was her burial. From that day onward, the soil itself became the silent executioner of Rome's sacred virgins. Paneria's immurement was not merely her death. It was the beginning of a legacy of terror that stretched across centuries. Rome was a city built on faith and fear. Every victory, every harvest, every moment of survival seemed bound to the gods. And when disaster struck, it was not the army or the Senate alone that carried the blame. It was often the Vestal Virgins, Rome's sacred daughters, who bore the weight of divine anger. Among the earliest remembered tragedies was that of a young priestess named Urbinia, whose life ended not by chance but by ritual necessity. The year was marked by despair. A plague swept through the crowded streets, choking the air with death. Corpses piled faster than they could be buried, and prayers rose from every temple, unanswered. Panic spread like fire. Rome searched for meaning, and meaning demanded a scapegoat. Whispers began in the Forum. The sacred flame of Vesta had faltered, a sign that the goddess herself was displeased. The guardians of that fire, the Vestals, came under suspicion. Urbinia was the one chosen for blame. The accusation was not born of evidence but of desperation. She was said to have allowed impurity into her life, to have broken the vow that bound her to chastity. Such charges could not be disproved. The very suggestion was enough, for if Rome believed a Vestal was guilty, the gods must be appeased. And so, with trembling hands and trembling voices, the priests condemned her to death. The sentence was not immediate. Before her burial, Urbinia endured another cruelty, the scourge. In the name of purification, she was stripped of her sacred veil and lashed by the lictors until her back was torn and raw. The blows were not meant to kill her, but to humiliate, to reduce the goddess's servant to a trembling mortal before the eyes of Rome. Each strike was said to carry away a fragment of Rome's guilt, transferring the sins of the city onto her body. But the scourging was not enough. Rome demanded blood, and the gods demanded silence. On the appointed evening, she was veiled again, not as a priestess but as a victim. The Pontifex Maximus himself presided, for the ritual of a Vestal's burial was too sacred for lesser priests. At twilight, as shadows stretched across the city, Urbinia was led to the Colline Gate. The people did not cheer, nor did they resist. They watched in silence, their eyes heavy with fear, for all believed her death might turn the plague aside. The chamber beneath the earth had been prepared as always: a couch, a lamp, a jug of water, and a loaf of bread. These were not gifts of mercy but a ritual pretense, allowing the Romans to claim they had not murdered a consecrated woman, but merely left her to the will of the gods. To them, it was sacrifice, the offering of purity to restore divine favor. To Urbinia, it was a slow and suffocating death. When she reached the steps, some said she walked steadily, refusing to let her executioners see her falter. Others whispered that she wept quietly, clutching the folds of her robe. Whatever her final gestures, they are lost to time. What remains certain is the ritual itself. She descended into the darkness, her feet echoing on the stone, until the air swallowed her whole. The priests sealed the chamber with a slab of stone, rolling it into place with grim finality. The sound thundered like judgment, a sound the crowd would never forget. Urbinia was gone, entombed alive, left to starve, suffocate, or fade into delirium in the darkness beneath the city. Above, the eternal flame still burned, as if mocking the fate of the woman who had once tended it. Rome hoped her death would break the plague. Some claimed the sickness slowed after her burial, others that it raged on regardless. But in the end, the truth was less important than the ritual. By sacrificing a Vestal, Rome convinced itself it had done all it could. The responsibility for the plague was no longer theirs. It had been buried with Urbinia. For generations afterward, her name lingered as both warning and memory. Mothers whispered it to their daughters chosen for Vesta's service, a reminder that their lives were never truly their own. For the Vestals, Urbinia's story became a shadow in their chambers, a reminder that even innocence could not save them if the gods, or the people, demanded blood. In the silence of her tomb, Urbinia was more than a girl. She was Rome's offering, the vessel of its fear, the body upon which a city laid its guilt. Her sacrifice marked a chilling truth that in times of crisis, even the most sacred were not spared, and the eternal city would feed upon its daughters to survive. In the year 337 BCE, a rumor crept through the marble pillars and bustling markets of Rome. a whisper that carried the weight of sacrilege. It was said that Minutia, one of the 6 sacred Vestal Virgins, had broken her vow of chastity. At first, the people dismissed it. Minutia was admired for her piety, her refined upbringing, her noble blood. She came from a family that dined with senators and shared laughter with Rome's most powerful men. How could a woman so adored be guilty of something so unspeakable? Yet in Rome, whispers had sharp teeth. They grew into murmurs, and the murmurs into an accusation that could not be ignored. The charge was incestum, the gravest crime a Vestal Virgin could commit. To the Romans, this was not merely adultery, nor a private sin. It was a stain on the city's very covenant with the gods. The chastity of the Vestals symbolized the purity of Rome itself. To break it was to invite divine wrath upon the empire. Floods, famine, or enemy invasion could all be blamed on a virgin's lapse, and so when suspicion fell on Minutia, her fate was no longer her own. It belonged to Rome. The trial was held under the solemn gaze of the Pontifex Maximus, the high priest who held the power to protect or condemn. Flanked by his college of priests, he listened as accusations unfolded. Witnesses spoke in trembling voices, weaving tales of Minutia's vanity, her love of fine clothes, her taste for jewels, her glances that lingered too long on men who passed. There was no proof of an affair, no lover dragged forward in chains. But in Rome, suspicion itself was poison. If a Vestal looked less like a nun and more like a noblewoman, people assumed corruption had already taken root. Her family pleaded for mercy. They argued her innocence, her devotion, her spotless record of service. Minutia herself denied every claim, her voice steady though her hands betrayed a faint tremor. Yet the Pontifex and his priests were unmoved. The vote was cast, and the verdict fell like a sword guilty. For a Roman criminal, the sentence might have been flogging, exile, or even a clean death by execution. But for a Vestal Virgin, there was only one punishment, older than the stones of the Forum itself, burial alive. No blood could be spilled from a sacred priestess. The city forbade it. Instead, she was to be entombed beneath the earth, sealed in silence, her breath slowly stolen by the darkness. On the appointed morning, the skies hung gray, heavy with clouds as though Rome itself mourned. A procession wound its way to the Colline Gate, where a narrow underground chamber had been prepared. The people gathered in hushed clusters, their eyes fixed on the figure in white. Minutia walked at the center, her body veiled, her head bowed. She was not dragged in chains, but neither did she walk free. To see her was to witness a paradox, a priestess honored by the gods, and yet condemned by men. At the mouth of the pit, she paused. The priests offered her a final ritual meal, a loaf of bread, a small flask of water, a scattering of grain, and a single oil lamp. These were not gifts of mercy but symbols of formality, tokens meant to soothe the gods, to show that Rome had not killed its virgin outright, but had merely given her to the earth. The crowd held its breath as Minutia descended the ladder into the tomb. The air grew colder, the sound of her steps echoing off stone walls. She turned once, her veil trembling as though she searched for one last glimpse of light, one familiar face among the multitude. There was none. When she reached the bottom, the priests pulled away the ladder. They sealed the entrance with slabs of stone and heaped soil over the opening. Her world shrank to a chamber of shadows. The lamp flickered, casting a faint circle of gold across her pale hands. With bread untouched beside her and prayers still whispering from her lips, Minutia sank to her knees. Above her, life in Rome continued. The chatter of merchants returned, the clatter of soldiers' boots echoed through the streets, and the eternal flame of Vesta burned undisturbed in its temple. The city did not falter. To the Romans, this was proof that the gods were appeased, that justice had been done. Yet beneath the ground, a young woman's breaths grew shorter, her heartbeat weaker, until only silence remained. Rome had saved itself, but at the cost of burying alive one of its daughters, and the people, watching, complicit, unmoving, knew this. The city's power did not lie only in its legions or its laws, but in its willingness to sacrifice the innocent for the illusion of divine order. The year was 216 BCE, and Rome was a city trembling under the shadow of disaster. The catastrophic defeat at Cannae had shaken the Republic to its core. More than 50,000 Roman soldiers lay dead on the battlefield, their blood soaking foreign soil. Mothers wept, widows tore their garments, and the streets of Rome echoed with a question that no one dared to answer: had the gods abandoned them? In times of fear, suspicion seeks the nearest victim. That year, it was not the legions or the generals who bore the brunt of Rome's rage, but two young women sworn to chastity and service, the Vestal Virgins Opimia and Floronia. They were accused of the unthinkable, profaning the hearth of Vesta. The sacred fire that symbolized the eternal life of Rome was said to have been dishonored by their impurity, and in a city desperate to explain its ruin, impurity was more than a sin. It was a curse. The accusations spread like wildfire through the forum. To common citizens, the deaths at Cana were not merely the work of Hannibal's cunning, but a punishment for divine betrayal. The gods must have been insulted, and someone had to pay the price. The eyes of the city turned on Opimia and Floronia. Their faces, once symbols of purity, became scapegoats for Rome's grief. The Pontifex Maximus convened the sacred court. The trial was brief, for fear demanded swiftness. No lover was paraded forth, no proof offered beyond rumor. In a city so shaken, evidence was unnecessary. The charge of incestum was conviction enough. For Rome, the punishment was not about truth, but about appeasement. Opimia and Floronia were given their choice, though to call it a choice was a cruelty in itself. Ceremony dictated that a condemned Vestal might meet death in one of two ways. She could take her life with her own hands, sparing herself the public ritual of burial, or she could submit to the old law, to descend into the narrow tomb beneath the Colline Gate, there to suffocate in silence. Floronia was the first to decide. Overcome with despair, she saw no path forward but to escape Rome's hands by her own. Before the sentence could be carried out, she ended her life. To some, her act was cowardice; to others, it was the last flicker of control in a world that had stripped her of every dignity. The record of her final moments is brief. A body found lifeless, the city whispering that at least one virgin had paid with her blood. Opimia's fate was different. She did not resist when the guards led her through the streets. Cloaked in white, veiled from the eyes of the citizens, she walked toward the Colline Gate where the pit awaited. The crowd gathered in silence, as though speaking aloud might bring the gods' wrath crashing down faster. For them, this was no ordinary execution. It was a ritual sacrifice, a desperate offering to restore divine favor. The priests performed the rites with cold precision. A lamp was lit and placed in the tomb, its glow feeble against the suffocating dark. Bread, water, and a scattering of grain were set beside it, a cruel mockery of sustenance, for all knew these tokens could not prolong life for long. Then Opimia, trembling but upright, descended the steps. Each footfall seemed to echo louder than the last, a heartbeat against stone. When she reached the bottom, she turned to face the world above for the final time. There were no words recorded, no plea preserved, only the image of a veiled figure swallowed by shadow. The entrance was sealed with stones, one slab upon another, until the earth itself had become her coffin. By dawn, Rome had two fewer daughters. One had died by her own hand, the other entombed alive beneath the city's soil. Together, their fates were presented as atonement, a sacrifice demanded by fear and sanctioned by law. Rome's leaders declared that the gods had been appeased. The eternal flame was tended, the rituals performed, and life in the city stumbled forward, bloodied but unbroken. Yet beneath the surface, the cost lingered. The Republic had survived Cana, but only by feeding its terror with the lives of two innocents. In Rome, purity was demanded, sacrifice enforced, and the line between justice and superstition blurred until it was written not in law but in blood. In 114 BCE, Rome was a city already restless with anxiety. Omens weighed heavily on the Roman imagination, and when the skies spoke, the people listened with dread. That year, lightning struck with a force that sent tremors through the city. A young girl, daughter of an equestrian family, was killed in the blast. To the modern mind it might seem chance, but to the Romans, such events were never accidents. A death by lightning was not merely a natural disaster. It was a message from the gods, and the message was clear: something sacred had been profaned. The priests gathered to interpret the sign. Their verdict came swiftly and without mercy. The flame of Vesta, the eternal heart of Rome, was thought to be endangered. The guardians of that flame, the Vestal Virgins, became the focus of suspicion. 3 names were spoken with quiet gravity: Aemilia, Marcia, and Licinia. They were accused of incestum, the most terrible of crimes for a Vestal. Chastity was not just a vow for these women, it was the foundation of Rome's covenant with the gods. To break it was to imperil the state itself. Aemilia's name carried particular weight. She was of noble blood, her family entwined with Rome's ruling class. Her very station made the accusation all the more devastating. If a daughter of Rome's elite could not remain pure, what hope was left for the city's stability? The trial unfolded under the stern gaze of the Pontifex Maximus, whose authority over the Vestals was absolute. Witnesses came forward, their voices trembling as they whispered of secret meetings, of shadows seen where none should be, of gestures interpreted as signs of guilt. Whether these accounts were truth or invention mattered little. In times of fear, the demand for a scapegoat outweighs the search for justice. Marcia and Licinia's fates would follow in their turn, but it was Aemilia who bore the first sentence. She stood before her judges, clad still in the white of her office, yet her dignity lay in tatters. The symbol of Rome's sacred purity had been recast as its greatest danger. The verdict was read: guilty. On the appointed day, the ritual of death was carried out with solemn precision. Aemilia was led from the temple, veiled so that no citizen might meet her eyes. The crowd pressed forward in silence, not daring to speak, not daring to intervene. To oppose the punishment was to oppose the gods themselves, and so even those who pitied her remained still, their grief bound by fear. The procession moved toward the Colline Gate, to the place where the earth would claim her. There the sacred pit awaited. Bread, water, milk, and oil were placed inside, a cruel pretense of sustenance, so that Rome could claim the Virgin had not been killed, only given to the earth. Yet all knew what awaited within darkness, silence, and the slow suffocation of a body left to the soil. Aemilia descended with quiet steps. No words of protest are recorded, no cries of desperation preserved. Perhaps she prayed, perhaps she wept, or perhaps the weight of inevitability silenced her before the tomb did. The priests spoke a final prayer as the stone slab was pulled into place, sealing her away from the world she had once served. A hush fell over the forum. The crowd dispersed slowly, each face heavy with the knowledge of what they had witnessed. A life had been taken, not by sword or fire, but by ritual, by the crushing hand of tradition dressed as justice. Rome would move forward, its eternal flame burning still, yet beneath its glow, the memory of Aemilia's fate lingered, a reminder that the city's survival often demanded the sacrifice of its daughters. For Rome, the gods had been appeased. For Aemilia, the earth became her prison and her grave, and in that silence, Rome's leaders declared the balance restored, even as the whispers of injustice haunted those who dared to remember. The year after Aemilia's burial, Rome still trembled beneath the weight of omens. The execution of one Vestal had not been enough to ease the city's terror. The lightning strike, the whispers of divine anger, and the shame of scandal had left scars too deep. In 113 BCE, fury returned to the Forum. A populist tribune, seizing the mood of the crowd, reopened the cases of the 2 surviving accused, Marcia and Licinia. This time, there would be no quiet proceedings hidden within temple walls. The trial was dragged into the open air of the Forum, transformed into a spectacle for the masses. Soldiers ringed the square to contain the swelling crowd. Plebeians pressed close, their shouts rising with each moment. Rome was not seeking justice. Rome was demanding blood. The Vestals appeared in white robes, their faces pale against the merciless sun. Marcia and Licinia stood with hands folded, lips pressed into silence. They had denied the charges before, had pleaded for innocence, but their voices had been drowned by the roar of the people. To the mob, these women were no longer holy. They were symbols of corruption, scapegoats for every disaster, sacrifices to satisfy the fury of gods and men alike. The tribune's words were sharp and merciless. He thundered that Rome's survival demanded purity, that the state could not suffer tainted priestesses within its sacred order. Every gesture, every glance was twisted into evidence. Their chastity was not simply doubted, it was condemned outright. The crowd howled approval, their anger feeding on itself until reason had no place. The verdict was not a verdict at all, but a riot cast as judgment. The vote was declared, and both women were found guilty, not by the measured voices of law, but by the deafening roar of the forum. Their sacred robes were stripped from them, leaving them exposed, no longer daughters of Vesta but criminals condemned. Even stripped of dignity, Marcia and Licinia did not falter. Witnesses wrote that their lips held firm, their silence unbroken, their eyes fierce with defiance. If Rome would call them guilty, they would not beg for mercy. They carried themselves as priestesses to the last, even as their city betrayed them. The procession to the Colline Gate was slow, heavy with ritual. Priests surrounded them, chanting solemn prayers. Soldiers pushed the crowd back as the people pressed forward, desperate to glimpse the final moments. The air was thick with heat and dust, every sound amplified by anticipation. At the mouth of the pit, the ceremony unfolded as it had for Aemilia. Bread, water, milk, and oil were lowered into the chamber, offerings that mocked survival more than they promised it. The entrance yawned dark and cold, a wound in the earth ready to consume them. Together, Marcia and Licinia descended. Step by step, side by side, they walked into the tomb without hesitation. The defiance in their eyes did not fade, even as the shadows closed in. In unison, they vanished into the blackness, the last flicker of light from the priest's lamp catching their veils before being swallowed whole. The heavy stone slab was rolled forward. It thundered into place, sealing the chamber. The sound reverberated through the forum like a final heartbeat, then silence. For a long moment, the crowd was hushed, as if stunned by the enormity of what they had witnessed. 2 lives extinguished beneath their feet, not by sword or flame, but by ritual burial, Rome's peculiar cruelty, cloaked in the language of law and religion. The priests declared the gods appeased. The tribune claimed victory for the people. Yet beneath the triumph, unease lingered. Rome had demanded purity and found satisfaction in sacrifice. But the price had been 2 women whose only crime may have been to stand at the wrong time in history's storm. As the eternal flame continued to burn, the memory of Marcia and Licinia lingered like smoke in the air, unseen, but choking those who dared to breathe too deeply. Their silence beneath the earth was Rome's silence, as well the silence of a city that chose vengeance over truth. By the closing years of the 1st century CE, the Roman Empire had grown vast, wealthy, and corrupt in the eyes of its new ruler. Domitian, son of Vespasian, had ascended to power with a vision of moral renewal. Where others saw prosperity, he saw decay. Where others admired indulgence, he saw sin. Cloaked in the authority of Pontifex Maximus, he set himself not only as emperor but as moral guardian of the state. And in his zeal, he turned his gaze upon the most sacred women of Rome, the Vestal Virgins. For centuries, the Vestals had stood above suspicion, their sanctity guarded by tradition. They were the daughters of Rome's nobility, chosen to preserve the flame that symbolized the city's eternity. But under Domitian, their position offered no protection. In his pursuit of purity, suspicion became weapon. He accused 4 priestesses, Cornelia, Oculata, and 2 others whose names survive only in fragments of memory, of incestum, the violation of their vow of chastity. It was not merely a crime of the flesh, but an act Domitian declared treason against Rome itself. Unlike past trials, this was no solemn inquiry by the College of Pontiffs, no sacred rituals, no careful ceremonies of judgment. Domitian's inquisition was swift and merciless, conducted under his personal authority. The emperor himself pronounced guilt, his word higher than law. The dignity of the Vestals meant nothing in the shadow of imperial wrath. The punishments were delivered without spectacle, yet all the more chilling for their simplicity. 3 of the accused were granted what was called the swifter mercy, execution by poison or sword. But before death, each woman endured a final humiliation. Her hair, long braided in the style of priestesses, was cut away. These braids were more than adornment. They were a crown of sanctity, a symbol of her bond to Vesta. To strip them was to strip her of status, identity, and purity. In the eyes of Rome, she died not as a Vestal, but but as a disgraced woman. One by one, the condemned were led to the marble steps of the temple. There, in the heart of Rome, their lives were ended. No public cheers, no ritual prayers. Only the silence of soldiers and the cold authority of Domitian's command. The blade fell, or the poison was swallowed, and with each death another symbol of Rome's divine protection was extinguished. The fourth priestess, Cornelia, chief vestal and guardian of the flame, was spared immediate execution, but her ordeal would come in its own turn. Her case, heavier in weight, demanded a separate cruelty. Domitian ordered her to the ancient punishment burial alive beneath the earth. In this, the emperor cloaked his zeal in tradition, but it was a tradition warped by his personal hunger for control. Historians would later record these purges as acts of tyranny, examples of Domitian's paranoia dressed as piety. Yet for the women who suffered beneath him, such judgments came too late. In their final hours, their silence spoke louder than any accusation. They did not confess, nor did they beg. Their dignity remained, even as their braids fell and their blood stained the stone. Domitian's decree sent a message that echoed through every corner of Rome: no station, no sacred vow, no divine role could shield one from imperial wrath. The emperor was the law, and the gods themselves seemed to bend beneath his will. But for all his zeal, Domitian could not erase the unease that lingered in the city. Rome's eternal flame continued to burn, tended by the remaining Vestals, yet it burned heavy with the memory of those who had died at their emperor's command. For the people, the flame was no longer untouchable purity. It was a light shadowed by fear, its guardianship stained by blood. And so the empire moved forward. Its divine daughters diminished, its sanctity bent to the will of one man. Domitian had proven that even the most sacred traditions of Rome were not eternal, but fragile, vulnerable to the fury of a ruler who mistook vengeance for virtue. In the year 91 CE, the cruelty of Emperor Domitian reached its darkest climax. Rome, already trembling under his iron hand, watched as he turned his wrath upon the very priestesses sworn to guard the eternal flame of the city. Cornelia, the Virgo Vestalis Maxima, the chief of the Vestals, stood at the center of his accusations. For decades she had been the embodiment of chastity, discipline, and sacred duty, yet under Domitian, even sanctity itself could be twisted into guilt. The charge was the same impossible crime that had haunted the Vestals for centuries: unchastity, the betrayal of their vow of purity. But this trial was no search for truth. It was spectacle, punishment, and a warning to all of Rome. By striking down Cornelia, Domitian proved that no one, no matter how holy, no matter how revered, could stand above imperial suspicion. Dragged from the temple of Vesta, Cornelia was paraded through the forum. The city gathered not in reverence but in silence, a silence more damning than cries of rage. Romans understood what was about to unfold. The verdict had already been spoken by the emperor himself. The formality of accusation was nothing but theater. The forum stones burned hot under her feet as she was led past the temples and arches, past the monuments to Rome's supposed justice. She stumbled once upon the sacred steps leading toward her tomb. Instinctively, one of the guards reached to steady her, but Cornelia pulled away. She refused even the brush of a hand. She would walk alone. She would die untouched. The pit awaited her, Rome's most cruel punishment reserved for Vestals who had broken their vows. It was a tomb carved beneath the earth, hollow and suffocating, prepared not for mercy but for slow, deliberate erasure. Unlike other executions, no Roman could claim to shed Vestal blood. The priestess was left to perish in silence, entombed alive. Food, a lamp, and a couch were placed within, a mockery of compassion. The empire pretended not to kill her, yet the stone door that sealed the chamber was a death sentence beyond appeal. Standing at its threshold, Cornelia turned once to face the world that condemned her. She spoke not to Domitian, not to the priests who delivered her, but to the air itself, perhaps to Vesta, perhaps to history. With a solemn prayer, she declared her innocence. She made no plea for life. She demanded no mercy. Her final words were not a cry, but a testament the vow she had lived by was unbroken, no matter what Rome believed. Then came the last humiliation. The slab of stone thundered shut, sealing the darkness. Outside, the forum resumed its life. The traitors shouted, The soldiers marched, the emperor gloated. Inside the tomb, silence reigned. Cornelia's fate was slower than the sword, more dreadful than poison. She was buried alive not as a criminal, but as a warning. Rome did not burn her body, did not leave her to the beasts. She was smothered by shadows, entombed in a parody of sanctity, sacrificed by the very system she had served. With Cornelia's death, the ancient rite of burying Vestals alive reached its end. She was the last to endure the punishment that had stained Rome for centuries. Her silence in death became louder than any verdict. For generations, her story whispered through the annals of history that even Rome's holiest daughters were not spared the cruelty of emperors. Domitian thought he had broken her, thought he had crushed her name beneath stone. But Cornelia's defiance endured. She walked into the tomb alone, her body uncorrupted, her vow intact. Rome buried her alive, but it could not bury the truth of her purity. In the suffocating dark, Cornelia became more than a victim. She became a symbol of resistance against tyranny, the last Vestal sacrifice to Rome's hunger for control. And in that final silence, she proved that sometimes death itself speaks louder than empire. By the 4th century CE, the Roman world was crumbling beneath the weight of change. The empire no longer looked like the Rome of old, its gods weakened, its temples emptying, its rituals fading into shadows. Christianity was rising, its crosses replacing the laurel wreaths, its prayers replacing the chants of Jupiter and Mars. And among the first sacrifices to this new age were the daughters of Vesta. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins had been the living symbols of Rome's eternal spirit. They had guarded the sacred flame, the fire said to ensure the survival of the city itself. From the reign of kings to the heights of the Caesars, they had stood as Rome's most untouchable priestesses. Honored, feared, sometimes condemned, but always essential. Their power was older than emperors. Their presence was older than the empire itself. Yet by the 4th century, their sacred role had become a relic, a ritual without believers. In the year 382, Emperor Gratian delivered the final blow. With a single decree, he stripped the Vestals of their privileges, their chariots, their stipends, their seats of honor. The eternal flame, the fire that had burned unbroken since Rome's founding, was left to die. No priests came to relight it, no guards stood watch. The hearth of the goddess went cold, its smoke curling upward for the last time. There was no spectacle, no trial, no blood spilled on the forum's stones. Rome's most haunting tradition did not end with screams or with the sealing of another tomb. It ended with silence. The house of the Vestals, once alive with hymns, processions, and whispered prayers, grew still. Its marble corridors, where generations of priestesses had walked in solemn grace, now echoed only with the footsteps of ghosts. The fall was not marked by ceremony. No one wept publicly, no one raised monuments, no crowds gathered as they once had to witness the fates of condemned sisters. Instead, the order dissolved like ash scattered on the wind. The last Vestals faded into obscurity, their names unrecorded, their faces forgotten. History did not bother to remember who they were. It only remembered that the fire had gone out. The house itself became a ruin. The grand courtyard, where sacred processions once began, filled with weeds. The chambers where young girls had lived and prayed became hollow shells, their walls cracked and stained. Travelers and wanderers who passed through the ruins spoke of strange feelings, of whispers on the breeze, of invisible eyes watching from broken arches. The ghosts of Rome's most mysterious women had not left. Those who dared to walk among the fallen stones said they could almost hear it. The faint shuffle of sandals across the marble, the soft hum of a hymn long forgotten. Perhaps it was the memory of centuries echoing through the architecture, or perhaps it was something darker. The restless spirits of the women buried alive beneath the city, their stories never truly silenced. The flame was gone, but its shadow remained. Each passing wind seemed to carry the voices of Marcia, Licinia, Cornelia, and the nameless many who had been sacrificed to Rome's fear of impurity. Their punishment had been meant to erase them, to bury their shame forever. Yet their silence became more enduring than any hymn. By the time Christianity claimed Rome's heart, the Vestals were nothing more than memory, a warning, a ghost, a legend too unsettling to vanish completely. The empire thought it had extinguished them, but like the embers of a fire buried beneath ash, their presence lingers still. Today, the ruins of their house stand in the Roman Forum, open to the sky. Tourists walk through the gardens, staring at crumbling walls and broken statues. Few realize that beneath their feet lie the echoes of nearly 1,000 years of devotion, sacrifice, and horror. The eternal flame has long since died, but the unspeakable stories of Rome's sacred virgins endure, carried not by fire, but by the whispers of time itself.